There never was a blacker Christmas for the civilized world than the Christmas of 1941. Millions of people had lost their homes, their families, their country. And millions more had lost their lives. Four-fifths of all the people in the world were involved in the greatest struggle in history. In Europe, Germany had occupied Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, made satellites of Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Finland, poured her troops into Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Yugoslavia, Greece, and 50,000 square miles of Russian territory. Fascist Italy had seized Albania and Ethiopia in Africa. And even before these nations were overrun, Japan had occupied Formosa, Korea, and part of China. French Indochina, with the consent of the Vichy regime, had become a Japanese base. In violation of her treaties, Japan had fortified the Marshall, Caroline, and the Mariana Islands. Cordell Hull, American Secretary of State, had used every means at his disposal to check Japanese aggression. In November 1941, Americans hoped that his efforts were meeting with success when the Japanese sent Saburo Kurusu, a special envoy, by plane to Washington. But Kurusu's trip was only a smokescreen. Even while the negotiations were in progress, Japanese aircraft carriers loaded with planes had started out for Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. It was a logical target, this great naval base in the Hawaiian Islands, 2,500 miles from California, 3,000 miles from Japan. The sneak attack succeeded in sinking or damaging 19 American ships, destroying 150 planes, and killing 3,077 men. By crippling this naval base, Japan became temporarily master of the Pacific. And Germany and Fascist Italy declared war on the United States. Here in the White House in Washington on the second day of January 1942, President Roosevelt and the representatives of 26 nations signed a pact of mutual aid against the aggressors. The pact reads, each government pledges itself to employ its full resources, military or economic, against those members of the Tripartite Pact and its adherents with which such government is at war. Each government pledges itself to cooperate with the government signatory hereto, and not to make a separate armistice or peace with the enemy. But it was a long time before the power of these United Nations could be felt. England, the last fortress of resistance in the West, lay only a few miles from Nazi-dominated Europe. Her cities were under constant bombardment by the Germans. Russia, bearing the brunt of the vast German attack, had to evacuate all of her great industries and rebuild them hundreds of miles from the war front. The people of China had been forced to carry whole factories back out of range of the Japanese advance. Only America, free from bombing and invasion, was able to produce to her full capacity. But her factories were not yet equipped for war. An industrial miracle had to be performed. Factories had to be rebuilt. retooled. The machines of peace removed. Those of war built and installed. Men who had made automobiles learned to make tanks and planes. Men who had repaired watches now made precision flight instruments. Women who had been housewives learned strange new skills. A peacetime army of 800,000 had to be built up to an army of millions. Men who had been farmers, fishermen, clerks, factory workers, bookkeepers, had to learn to fight. At first, they had to drill with wooden guns and trucks for tanks. The people of the United States, like others, had learned in a bitter lesson. They could not remain isolated from the rest of the world. They were drilling and preparing, learning to carry their share of the burden. And the armies of the United Nations were growing. The Americans, the British, and men from the great British Dominion, Russians, Chinese, Czechs, Greeks, men from India, free Norwegians who had escaped from madly dominated Europe, Yugoslavs, Dutch, Javanese, Poles, Danes, Luxembourgers, and Belgians, Filipinos, and free Frenchmen rallying to the fight under the standard of General de Gaulle. Great oceans separated the Allied powers. The shipping lanes were the lifelines of the United Nations. With the British and the American navies spread thin over the 5 oceans, the German U-boats became bolder. This was the Battle of the Atlantic in 1942. In 10 months, the Allies lost over 500 ships. With each of these sinkings went down tons of desperately needed supplies for the fighting front in Russia, England, and Africa.
This was the Russian front in 1942. The Germans advanced, looting, torturing, murdering as they went. The casualties ran into the millions. They had driven 1,000 miles deep into Russian territory, into the wheat fields of the Ukraine, the great industrial centers of the South. But Russia, with her scorched earth policy, left nothing of value behind. Wheat which could not be harvested was set afire. Bridges were blown up, dams, railroads, power plants. Nothing was left that might be of use to the enemy. Old men, women, and children who had lost their villages became guerrilla fighters. They formed bands to sabotage and harass the Germans from behind the line. The main German offensives were directed against Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and the Caucasus in the south. The Russians, in desperate battles, counterattacked and checked the advance on Leningrad and Moscow. But in the south, on July 1st, 1942, after a siege of 180 days, Sevastopol fell. The German army now massed for an all-out drive on Stalingrad and the Caucasus. The conquest of the Caucasus and the capture of Stalingrad would block Russia's vital Middle East oil supply and make this oil available for the German war machine. Simultaneously in Africa, other German forces were driving for Suez to cut the British lifeline of supply.
This was the North African front in 1942. The outnumbered and poorly equipped British Empire and fighting French forces had to retreat before the German advance. They were driven back across the desert to El Alamein, only 60 miles from Alexandria, key to the Suez Canal.
And on the Pacific front in 1942, the Japanese had spread like locusts over the eastern archipelago. Following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had taken the American outposts of Wake and Guam. Hong Kong fell. Thailand yielded. The Philippines fell. And in swift succession, Singapore, Burma, the Netherlands East Indies, New Guinea, New Britain, the Solomons. Attu and Kiska in the American Aleutian Islands. The Allied line of defense in the Pacific was pushed back to an arc which pivoted on the Hawaiian Islands in the center. Near Pearl Harbor, and essential to its defense, is the American outpost of Midway. If this defense line were to be breached, the United States Navy would be swept from the Pacific. On June 3rd, 1942, American patrols sighted Japanese warships and troop transports several hundred miles out at sea, heading for this island of Midway. Upon Admiral Nimitz, commander of the Central Pacific Front, rested a grave responsibility. He decided that this was the place to make a stand and committed all available ships to a bold attack. The future of the Pacific lay in the hands of these young naval aviators. This was a new kind of sea battle. The two fleets were never within sight of each other. Aircraft carriers, great floating airports, served as bases from which the planes took off to attack the opposing fleet over 100 miles away. The Battle of Midway set the pattern for other sea battles which followed in the Pacific. While the American planes were on their mission, Japanese planes in turn attacked the American fleet. States lost one destroyer and the aircraft carrier Yorktown, one of the only 3 undamaged American carriers in the Pacific. But simultaneously, American planes had been giving the Japanese a savage hammering. The Japanese task force was routed. They lost 4 modern aircraft carriers, 2 heavy cruisers, 3 destroyers, and suffered severe damage to other ships, including battleships. The Battle of Midway was a defensive battle only, but it marked a turning point in the Pacific War.
Simultaneously in Egypt, the Allied armies were preparing for their crucial battle at El Alamein, 60 miles from Alexandria. In spite of their defeats, this army had remained largely intact, thanks to the gallant stand of the fighting French at Bir Hakeim under General Koenig. In August 1942, the Germans under Marshal Rommel sent in tanks to breach a hole in the Allied lines through which the infantry could follow. This was the accepted blitzkrieg tactic. Massed British artillery and armored forces allowed the tanks to pass through their lines. They then closed in and destroyed them. Tanks of the German Afrika Corps were left burning in the desert. This, too, was a defensive victory only, but it marked the turning point in the African campaign. The German advance was stopped. Suez was safe.
And on the Russian front, the crisis was nearing at Stalingrad, key to Russia's supply line. For 40 days and 40 nights, the Germans had been hammering at the city. Time after time, Hitler had promised his people, Stalingrad will be ours. But Marshal Stalin had said to his armies, not one step back. Germany threw thousands of men, enormous amounts of material into the fight. But stubbornly, the Russians fought on, behind crumbling walls, in suburban gardens, in factories, in houses, on stairways. And Stalingrad held.
Here, in the streets of Stalingrad, as in the Egyptian desert, off a tiny sand spit in mid-Pacific, were fought the battles which changed the course of history. To the young Russians, British, Frenchmen, and Americans who died in these battles, the free world will forever be in debt. By the summer of 1942, materials for war were coming in ever-increasing numbers from the production line. Britain's factories were going 24 hours a day. With every able-bodied man in uniform, 75% of the work was being done by women. Work stopped only when enemy bombers were directly overhead. In Russia, though some factories were bombed and destroyed again and again, the workers continued to produce among the ruins. The Chinese, with their only supply route, the Burma Road, in Japanese hands, started work on a new road. Men, women, and children built great airfields with their bare hands against the time when giant bombers would be flown in from America. Brazil, in South America, was supplying rubber to her allies. Bauxite was coming in from Dutch Guiana. But it was to the United States that the Allied powers looked for their greatest flow of war material. By the end of 1942, American production was fully mobilized. The material resources and manpower of the nation were concentrated in a supreme effort to supply the fighting front. Machines of war burn vast quantities of oil. America had to supply the great proportion of this oil. Material from thousands of American factories was sent by 100 routes to every continent. To get these men and materials to the theaters of war was a colossal task. They needed ships. Nothing could move without ships. Great shipyards sprang up in every coastal city. People far inland, who had never seen an ocean, were building parts of ships to be sent overland and then assembled on the coast 1,000 miles away. In 1940, the United States built 54 ships. In 1942, they built 746. In the first 6 months of 1943, they would build 879. But to guarantee that these ships and supplies reached their destinations, more ships were needed. Fighting ships, submarines, destroyers, cruisers, battleships. Aircraft carriers. Ships and men from all the United Nations made up the escort for the precious cargo. The speed of a convoy is held down to that of its slowest ship, routes for law. Supplies had to go to England by way of Newfoundland and Iceland, to Russia around Norway to Moment, or by a safer route around South Africa through Iran. With the Mediterranean under Axis control, supplies to the Allied armies in North Africa also had to go around the Cape of Good Hope, through the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea to Suez. To get materials to hard-pressed China meant a trip halfway around the world, from New York around South Africa, or from California around Australia and through India. With her seaports and the Burma Road occupied by the Japanese, everything for China had to be brought in from India over caravan trails or by air, by the most modern means of transportation, or the oldest. Travel over the Atlantic meant thousands of miles of enemy-infested water. A never-ending battle was waged against the U-boats. So successfully was this done that Allied sinkings were reduced from a high point of 111 ships in June 1942 to only 11 in October of the same year. At this critical time, 20,000 ships were convoyed across the sea, and out of every 200, 199 reached port safely. American soldiers landed in England and the north of Ireland. At the invitation of the Free French, they landed on the island of New Caledonia in the Pacific, an island strategically located as a base from which to attack the Japanese. Materials for Russia arrived in Iran. Fresh troops and supplies from England and India arrived in Egypt. Urgently needed cargoes were carried by air. The airplane at last became a major means of transportation. The United States Army Air Transport Command opened air routes that covered 110,000 miles. They brought airplane parts for the armies in Egypt, repair parts for tanks in the battle area, hand grenades to the soldiers in the Pacific. They dropped food and medical supplies to isolated forces in the jungles of New Guinea. The tide had begun to turn. The United Nations were at last in a position to take the offensive.
The first Allied thrust came in the summer of 1942 against the Japanese in the Pacific. The Allied objectives were mere pinpoints in the vast reaches of the ocean: Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands and southern New Guinea. The Allied plan was to wrest these important islands one by one from entrenched Japanese soldiers and Marines. On August 7th, 1942, American Marines in their first major amphibious operation landed on Guadalcanal. The American General MacArthur, at the request of the Australian government, had been made Supreme Commander in the Southwest Pacific. Under his command, troops from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States started a second attack on the huge tropical island of New Guinea. These men faced many dangers: malaria, jungle fever, dysentery, deadly snakes, starvation. They were fighting a fanatical enemy. An enemy who had been taught that if he died in battle, he would become a god. This was no war of massed tanks and artillery. It was a nightmare struggle of man against man. From behind every tree, every bush, every innocent bit of ground, there might come sudden death. Battles were long and tense. For many weeks it seemed likely that the Allied forces would be overwhelmed. The losses were great on both sides. These are Japanese dead. And these are American. Had it not been for the help and cooperation of friendly islanders, many more men would have died of their wounds, alone in the jungle. The Japanese recognized the importance of this campaign. They threw in major elements of their fleet in desperate counterattacks. In fierce night battles, their naval forces were destroyed. The American Navy had established definite superiority in the South Pacific. Supply lines to America were secure. The first Pacific offensive had been successful. The United Nations now had air and sea bases from which to launch further attacks against the Japanese. Almost the first use to which these airfields were put was to evacuate the wounded.
The second United Nations offensive was on the North African front. British General Alexander had taken over the supreme command in this theater. General Montgomery led the British 8th Army. At El Alamein, on the night of October 23rd, 1942, the Allies started their drive against the German Afrika Korps. After a heavy artillery barrage, General Montgomery surprised the Germans by reversing blitzkrieg tactics and sending his infantry in first. A week later, British tanks were pouring through a gap in the enemy's lines. This sledgehammer blow smashed German resistance. It rolled the Afrika Korps back in a retreat which was not to stop until they reached Tripoli, 4 months later and 1,200 miles away. Most of these prisoners are Italians who had been left behind for the Germans to cover their retreat. This is the German General von Thoma, commander of the Afrika Corps. And these, the fascist governors of Tripolitania. But the drive to Tripoli was only the eastern prong of a gigantic pincers movement. From the west, on November 7, 1942, 500 transports, protected by 350 naval craft, accomplished what was at that time the greatest amphibious operation in history. American and British troops, led by United States General Eisenhower, landed in French North Africa. Their objectives were to remobilize French forces in North Africa, to join with the British in Tunisia, and eventually to sweep the Germans from Africa and the Mediterranean. The Vichy government stood passively by while Hitler occupied all of France. But at Toulon, the French scuttled the bulk of their fleet before the Germans could seize it. Many of the officers went down with their ships. Some units managed to escape. Among them was the dreadnought Richelieu, which steamed into New York Harbor, proudly flying the tricolor. Again, as in the First World War, the people of New York paid tribute to their traditional French allies.
Halfway around the world on the plains outside Stalingrad, the Russians started their offensive. Two Russian armies, one in the north and one in the south, drove forward in a powerful pincers movement to encircle the Germans. Days later, the arms of this pincer had joined, cutting off the whole of the German armies in the Stalingrad area. Within the Iron Ring, the Russians began to liquidate the remaining German forces. The Stalingrad siege cost the Germans over 500,000 men and immense masses of war material. The German Sixth Army, which had spearheaded the drives into Poland and France, was completely destroyed. Among the thousands of prisoners taken were Romanians, led by fascists into war on the side of Germany. On February 5th, 1943, 24 German generals, as well as numerous other high officers, both German and Romanian, surrendered to the Russians. This is the Supreme Commander, Field Marshal Friedrich von Paulus. On the order of Marshal Stalin, salvos of 240 guns in Moscow celebrated the liberation of Stalingrad. This victory did more than save the Volga and the Caucasus. It decisively broke the last great German offensive. And together with the victories in Egypt and in the Pacific, it forever shattered the legend of German and Japanese invincibility. Dimly, still in the distant future, the end of tyranny could now be foreseen.
In January 1943, President Roosevelt flew to Casablanca in French Morocco for conferences with Prime Minister Churchill. General de Gaulle, leader of the fighting French, returned for the first time to French soil to attend the conference. The main objectives for 1943 were outlined: to extend the initiative already won in 1942, to dispatch all aid to China and to Russia, and to rearm French forces for new offensives against the Axis. The slogan of the conference was unconditional surrender for Germany and Japan.
While the leaders were still conferring, the British had advanced into Tunisia and had made contact with the Americans who had fought their way through from the west. This is General Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, greeting General Montgomery, leader of the British Eighth Army. The British continued to hammer their way up the Tunisian coast. The German commander drew his reserve south to face their assault. But a sudden attack in great violence from French, British, and American troops along the whole line smashed through the German defenses. American armored forces thrust fiercely to the gates of Bizerta. By May 12th, it was all over. Bizerta and Tunis fell. The tables had been turned. French soldiers now were guarding German prisoners. Germany paid dearly for the Tunisian campaign. Added to huge losses in material, 30,000 were killed, 20,000 more were wounded, and 291,000 were taken prisoner. Tunis was the first important French city to be taken from the Germans. The people celebrated their long-awaited freedom. At dawn on July 10, 1943, Allied troops landed on the beaches of Sicily. With this first penetration of Italian home territory, the fascist government of Italy collapsed. Benito Mussolini, who had been dictator of the Italian people for 21 uninterrupted years, fell from power. On September 3rd, United Nations forces invaded Italy itself. On that same day, the new Italian government surrendered to the Allies. The bulk of the Italian fleet, in accordance with the armistice terms, escaped the Germans and surrendered to General Eisenhower and British naval officers at Malta. The great port of Naples was an early prize of the Italian campaign. The most valuable acquisition of the fighting in Italy was Foggia, captured by General Montgomery's Eighth Army. With its elaborate network of airfields, Foggia gave the Allies, for the first time, bases within easy reach of German installations and war factories in southern Europe. Britain in the west was already a gigantic air base, from which thousands of bombers and fighters were attacking the Germans by day and by night. In daylight, American pilots were over targets chosen for their importance to the German war effort. Factories, warehouses, railroads, submarine bases, shipyards, docks, airfields, and oil refineries. At night, bombers of the British Royal Air Force were over the great war production centers of Germany. American and British air forces took heavy losses, but destruction of Germany's industrial heart was essential before the Allied armies could organize actual landings in Western Europe. And most important, the power of the German Luftwaffe had to be destroyed. On the ground, by fighters and attack bombers. In the air, by fighters and the crews of the flying fortresses and liberators.
The Russians, early in 1943, had launched another powerful offensive. They drove across the great rivers of Russia. From Stalingrad, they smashed the Germans back from the Volga, across the Don, the Dnieper, Dniester, and the Prut, to the Carpathian Mountains. In 6 months' time, they regained territory the Germans had spent 2 years and millions of lives to take. Thousands of towns were liberated. What survivors were left came out to give thanks to their deliverers. This is Marshal Shukoff. liberator of the Ukraine. At last, the guerrilla fighters who had fought so long behind enemy lines could come back to their homes.
Simultaneously, across the world, the United States Navy had attained sufficient strength for a drive across the Central Pacific. Their path lay through the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, which through the years had been heavily fortified by the Japanese. Powerful task forces built around new aircraft carriers led the way. Guns of America's new battle fleet shelled Japanese positions in advance of the assault groups. Carrier and land-based planes poured steel and fire on the defenders. Was upon the foot soldier that the ultimate decision rested. In the face of withering enemy fire, American Marines and Army troops made landings on tiny islands, Tarawa and Lakin, Kwajalein and Eniwetok. Savage hand-to-hand struggles were fought for possession of a fly speck on the map. But these fly specks dominated hundreds of thousands of square miles of ocean. Imperial Japanese Marines were wiped out on Tarawa alone. This was part of the price the Americans paid for Tarawa.
While these battles were still being fought, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill met with Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek in Cairo. Japan, these three allies agreed, shall be stripped of all the islands she has seized and all the territory stolen from China. The power of Japan's ruling class to upset the peace of the Pacific must be forever destroyed. Her ambition of a world empire must be shattered. A tremendous task still lay ahead. Tokyo was a long way off, and Japanese resistance would grow with every step of the way. To liberate the Pacific countries from Japanese occupation was a major war in itself. But however long it takes, after the defeat of tyrant Germany, the turn of tyrant Japan will come. 5 days after the Cairo conference, another conference was held at Tehran, capital of Allied Iran. Here, the chief executives of Britain and the United States met for the first time with Marshal Stalin. They reaffirmed their country's determination to work together in the war and in the peace to follow. In a joint statement, they declared, "We shall seek the cooperation and active participation of all nations, large and small, where peoples in heart and mind are dedicated, as are our own people, to the elimination of tyranny and slavery, oppression and intolerance. We will welcome them as they may choose to come into the world family of democratic nations." These Yugoslav partisans had already made their choice. Although their country was under German occupation, they were never defeated. Under the leadership of Marshal Tito, 300,000 of them fought on unceasingly. The underground in France, the other occupied countries, organized to form strong reserve armies, waiting for the day when they could join the United Nations in the fight against the common enemy. The dawn of that day came on June 6, 1944. Allied armies, troops of the United States, Great Britain, the Dominions, and forces of the men who had escaped from the occupied countries, all under the supreme command of General Eisenhower, set out by sea and air for Normandy. Germany was now being attacked simultaneously from Russia in the east, from Italy in the south, and from Great Britain in the west. This was the operation planned 6 months before at Tehran.
It was no easy task. In Europe and the Pacific, months of savage, bloody fighting lay ahead. Every foot of the way was bitterly contested by a ruthless enemy. But step by step, he was pushed back by the Allied armies. The underground forces of liberation knew their finest hour when the people of Paris rose to strike at the enemy. Even as the Allies battered at the gates, freedom returned to the City of Light. Freedom. This was the prize for which millions of free men had taken up arms, for which men had been willing to sacrifice their treasure and their lives. Only free peoples would be equal to the task of healing the wounds left by tyranny and aggression. But freedom cannot be secure without final victory, whatever the price that must be paid. It is in this knowledge that the Allied armies push relentlessly on, determined that with victory will come the fulfillment of the declaration made at Tehran, that all the peoples of the world may live free lives, untouched by tyranny, and according to their varying desires and their own consciences.